needless to say, I'm so happy to see you here. Thanks for taking the time, and some of you came quite a distance. This was a venture into the unknown for us, but I think it's going to be great. And of course, this is where A.J. Muste spent several years in his youth. He got his bachelor's degree in 1905, after being, of course, an athlete, an orator, an actor, and valedictorian of his class. So, when I was a student at Hope, back in the last century, as I like to say, I'd never heard of A.J. Muste. It wasn't until 1967, a few months after his death, that I received a copy of Hope's student newspaper, The Anchor, that contained a tribute to Muste by our august and honored professor of philosophy, D. Ivan Dijkstra. Dijkstra spoke highly and respectfully of Muste as a saint and a prophet. I wondered why I hadn't heard of him before. In time, I realized that many in the Reformed Church community held Muste at arm's length. He was a Christian minister, to be sure, but he was also a radical and had even been a communist. And he tended to hobnob with people of dubious reputation. In 1985, the year of Muste's 100th birthday, this began to change. Our beloved biology professor, the late Donald Cronkite, had learned about Muste and endowed what is now the annual Muste Memorial Lecture. And we were proud to welcome Joanne Robinson. Where did you go, Joanne? Oh, there you are, yes. Joanne Robinson, Muste's first biographer, to initiate the series. That's my phone. I hate them. I just ignore it. Just ignore it. Quite a few years. Okay, I hate these. That's why. Louder?
The microphone. Are you able to do that from?
What?
Yeah, I think you do it from here. I'll take care of it.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Where was I? Okay. 100th year, that's right. And okay, this sounds better. Joanne Muste's first biographer to initiate the series. Quite a few years later, I was put on the Muste Lecture Committee, which I took as an honor. Then one summer, our advancement office asked me to meet a Hope alumna, Mary Nesnek, who is here with us today. And she has a sterling record of commitment to peace and justice. Mary suggested that we invite one of Muste's associates, a man named David McReynolds, to come to campus as a lecturer. When I expressed concern about his age, she suggested that maybe somebody could go to New York and videotape his memories. I thought immediately of my old friend and former colleague, David Schock. I knew that David was an accomplished videographer who had produced a series of documentaries on issues of peace and justice and was especially known for Delayed Justice, 6 documentaries on unsolved homicides in West Michigan. I called David. He took the bait right away. As a result, we embarked on a string of journeys where we had the incredible privilege of meeting an unforgettable lineup of Muste's friends and co-workers, and indeed his grandson, Peter, who will be with us tomorrow. One of the places we visited, of course, was the A.J. Muste Institute in New York, now known as the A.J. Muste Foundation for Peace and Justice. I'm delighted to introduce Heidi Boghosian, the executive director of the foundation, and Johanna Fernandez, the foundation's chairperson. Heidi and Johanna, we are so happy that you are here, and we look forward to what you have to tell us. So please welcome.
Thank you, Kathleen. It is such an honor to be here among friends and associates, in part, of A.J. Muste and his legacy. I've been with the Institute for 10 years, And before I introduce our board chairperson, Johanna Fernandez, I thought I'd tell you a bit about myself and how I came to Muste. I went to law school after working for a number of years in the nonprofit sector. I worked for an Alternatives to Incarceration program, AIDS-related organizations at the beginning of the epidemic. And I thought that having a law degree would be beneficial in organizing. I returned to New York, and I was the director of the National Lawyers Guild for 15 years, a progressive bar association with some very radical attorneys around the country. And there I did a lot, we as an organization defended activists who were being targeted by the government. Back in 2005, environmental activists and animal rights activists were labeled the nation's top domestic terrorism threat. And a number of campaigns aggressively pursued them. At the Guild, we decided to start a hotline for people who'd been visited by the FBI for engaging in First Amendment protected activities. And we matched them with low bono or pro bono attorneys around the country. It was also the time of Occupy, so we defended protesters around the country through our various chapters and law school chapters. And we also found, it was a busy time, Anonymous was having a heyday, and so a lot of so-called hacktivists, altruistic hackers, were also being visited by the FBI and pressured by the Bureau to turn state's evidence against friends in exchange for avoiding harsh sentences. We created a hotline for them as well. I left the Guild around 2014, and I thought to myself, what other organization could I possibly go to that would have the kind of radical roots that the National Lawyers Guild did? We also did a lot of observing of First Amendment mass assemblies, protected mass assemblies and protests, and monitored police reaction. And we had legal observers, we still do, that go and observe interactions at large demonstrations. So I knew about the so-called Peace Pentagon, a fabulous building in Lower Manhattan that housed the War Resisters League. And I saw a job opening for executive director of the Muste Institute, and then I soon realized the Muste Institute had actually purchased that building from War Resisters League decades ago. And it was covered with banners, anti-war banners, wonderful protest banners in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrified years after we had purchased the building, and stood out really as a beacon of activism in a city that's now become a city for the super rich with dwindling activist spaces. So I was thrilled to get the job. And one of my first tasks was to help the board decide what to do with our beloved building, which needed millions of dollars in repairs that we could not afford. So unfortunately, we sold the building, but we recognized the importance of keeping a collaborative space, because at that building we had housed about 15 groups in addition to War Resisters League. We gave very low rent and affordable free meeting rooms for other groups that wanted to be able to enter a building. They didn't have to show ID. In the history of War Resisters League, having that building, it was so that they could avoid government harassment and could operate safely with other activists without fear of reprisal. So we rented a space for a few years, and now we're in the process of trying to decide if it's something we want to do to buy another space to bring back some of the activists, keeping in mind that after COVID, much of activism, and Johanna's going to speak briefly about this, the nature of it has changed a bit in terms of doing more online activism. Maybe if we have a space, it will be fewer offices, but more room for people to have meeting spaces, to come in to make props for protests before a demonstration, things like that. But we are celebrating our 50th year this year, and so we have just recently changed our name to the A.J. Muste Foundation for Peace and Justice, as Kathleen mentioned, to better reflect the scope of what we do, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But basically, we give grants to activist organizations around the nation. And we also serve as fiscal sponsor for groups that want to receive tax-deductible gifts but don't have their own 501c3. And increasingly, we recognize that as a really important part of what we do. A few years ago, in trying to bring younger and more diverse board members onto the Muste board, we were thrilled to have Johanna Fernandez, who is a professor of history at Baruch College in Manhattan, and also an award-winning historian whose book, The Young Lords, A Radical History, won 5 of the top nation's history awards two years ago. We were thrilled that she agreed to join us as board chairperson and to help guide us through a transition to what we're calling the modernization of the Muste Foundation as we try to reach younger audiences and continue to remain relevant in the changing face of activism. So Johanna is going to talk briefly about some of the threats that the groups that we fund are confronting right now.
Thank you, Heidi, and thank you for joining us in this conversation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about social movements and why they matter. And someone mentioned the word radical, and I thought as a professor I should define the term, which is misapprehended in the world and especially in American society. So radicals attempt to address the root causes of social problems, right? Radical literally means grasping at the roots. And we think that the term definitely defines a lot of what Muste dedicated himself to over the course of his life. And that brings us to social movements. Folks who build social movements, the best of them are radicals. And social movements are important because they expand the meaning, experience, and definition of freedom. We tend to think that the freedoms we have today have been handed to us by the Constitution, perhaps, or by the government, or perhaps the Supreme Court. But as many of us who are here know, in fact, activists, radicals, militants, and the protests and movements they build on the ground create a crisis in society. The issues they raise through their militant, nonviolent activism forces an issue into the public square, and their strategies pressure governments to offer up reforms in order to avoid revolution, in fact. And as I was thinking about the life of A.J. Muste, and the historian who's written about A.J. Muste is here. Where is she? There are two.
Yeah.
Two.
Leila isn't here yet, I don't think, is she?
Um,
Joanna's here, but not Leila.
So they might correct us, but it seems that A.J. Muste cut his teeth during World War I and the activism against the war during World War I. And you probably know that World War I is important for all kinds of different reasons, among them that it was a war that began with a pretty robust anti-war movement. And there was an enormous amount of repression against anti-war activists, including Eugene Debs, who was arrested during the war for giving an anti-war speech. All of the repression against anti-war activism, but also against women's rights activists during World War led to the Palmer raids immediately after the war, named after the DOJ, the head of the DOJ, the Department of Justice at the time. And immigrants, labor activists, peace activists were arrested en masse. And the right to free speech and association was violated horrifically by the US government. And it was this repression and the fight back against this repression by people like A.J. Muste and other activists that led to the litigation of the First Amendment in the courts, and ultimately that battle for the right to free speech and association led to the association of the American dream and American freedom with the First Amendment for the first time in American history. So prior to this moment, free speech was not something that was revered. But after these struggles and the rise of the American Civil Liberties Union, as a result of these struggles, we now revere and respect the First Amendment. And it was fascinating for us to discover that A.J. Muste was involved in the labor movement in the 1920s and the 1930s in no other place than the Fisher Body plant in Cleveland, which was the site of the first sit-down strike in the United States, the strike that unionized American workers on a mass scale. And this is something that my students are excited by, and that's that the sit-ins of the 1960s were inspired, in fact, by labor activism and the sit-down strikes of the 1930s. And as we know, the civil rights movement pretty much civilized American society and led to the rise of other movements, the women's movement, the gay and lesbian liberation movement, and most importantly, the anti-war movement, which defined so much of A.J. Muste's life, and the rise of this organization, the War Resisters League, which had been around, in fact, since the 1920s. But it grew exponentially. The A.J. Muste Foundation emerges in part to become a fiscal sponsor for the War Resisters League. So I just wanted to lay that out, that our experience of democracy, even though it's being challenged in this moment, comes out of social movements, and we thank A.J. Muste for the example he set. And our highest aspiration is to continue to support and resource that legacy of hope that activists bring to American society.
Now, on the screen, we've listed just some of the areas that we have funded over the years in terms of on-the-ground groups doing work. Community organizing, first and foremost, we look for in all of our applicants. But racial justice, police reform, criminal justice reform, including anti-death penalty initiatives, environmental justice, of course, LGBTQ plus activism, economic justice, immigrants' rights, workers' rights. And notably, we're really making a conscious effort to ensure that many of the groups we fund engage or work with youth activists around the country. We're going to show a few examples of groups that we funded. The first, Climate Defiance. This is a young organization, and it is youth-led. They're trying to elevate climate change to be a top 3 political issue in U.S. politics, ending fossil fuel extraction on federal lands and waters, ending sacrifice zones, and ushering in a just transition for those individuals who are most impacted. And they engage in collective direct action, which scores many points when we're looking at what groups do. So we funded their materials for their Climate Week action, in which they protested then Deputy Secretary of the Interior, who signed the Willow Project, and just 15 days later he resigned. The next group, I was very excited about this group because I used to do street law projects at the National Lawyers Guild. This is a new group. They're holding a 2-day-long, culturally relevant, trauma-informed workshop series teaching the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments of the Constitution to young African-American teenagers ages 13 through 18 coming from the south side of Chicago. The sessions will be taught by licensed criminal defense attorneys, victims, survivors of police abuse and torture, activists, and restorative justice practitioners. In Detroit, the Detroit Area Youth Uniting Michigan, their mission is to fight for a seat at the table for marginalized youth, once again youth, in decision-making about our communities that can range from gun violence to education justice, to addressing racism or homophobia. We funded their creation of a youth organizing base, and their interns are now fully trained youth organizers who demonstrate a strong understanding of, as Johanna referred to, the root cause analysis, along with campaign strategy and power mapping. And many of the groups that we fund are involved in training young people to be leaders in community organizing. And then just one more, this from New York, the Movement for Justice in El Barrio. They are an immigrant-led grassroots organization that is fighting for justice in East Harlem, New York. We gave them a grant to organize, to cut funding to U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, along with Customs and Border Protection, for the closing of immigrant family detention centers and for the release of immigrants in detention surrounding COVID-19. So those are just a few. Johanna's going to mention, I think, some of the really pressing and seemingly intractable larger areas of repression that we're facing and trying to help fund organizations address.
So part of what we've been doing at the Muste Foundation is to assess the moment politically, as I imagine that A.J. Muste was doing consistently with the folks he was working with. And so our discussions in board meetings have been very political. Like, what are the issues that define this era and this moment? What are the escalating problems that we want to respond to and find activists who are addressing on the ground through direct action? So we know that war is the major problem of our time, as it was in the 19-teens and the 1960s. We have been and we want to fund folks who are fighting against the war in Gaza and beyond, and the proliferation of militarization in our society. And accompanying that, the repression of free speech. You probably heard that at Barnard College, the university has made it illegal to post political material on the doors of your dorm room, your dormitory room, literally. And this has all been precipitated by the crisis in Gaza. Both Barnard and Columbia are Zionist institutions, or the leadership of those colleges are. And so this most basic of right, which is free speech, among college students, right? You go to a liberal arts college in part to be able to announce to the world what you represent and what you believe in on your door, and that's now illegal. So part of what we want to do in this period is fund groups that are working around the repression of speech. We know that the militarization of society is important. You probably know about the building of Cop City in Atlanta. And it seems that these cop cities are being built across the country. And so we're very attentive to groups that are organizing around this. There's also the proliferation of white supremacy and proto-fascist groups. Voter suppression is another issue that we are focusing on. Also challenges to a woman's right to choose and the backlash against abortion. And we are very attentive to immigration, not just as a domestic problem, but a consequence of war and environmental crisis and economic displacement. And so we want to work with groups that are looking at immigration and its root causes and that are fighting on the ground to protect immigrant communities against scapegoating.
One project that we funded in California is called Project Yano, and they work with youth in schools to educate them about alternatives to entering the military. And as you may know, there's been really a resurgence of junior ROTC programs in public schools around the country, often touting that they teach personal responsibility. In many areas, they've become a replacement for civics education, which has basically been on the chopping block for years in this country. But we're concerned about the teaching of deference to authority, which is obviously a component of becoming a more militarized society. We funded Project Yano doing a textbook analysis of the books that junior ROTC programs use. And it's a fascinating study. As I mention this, I'm reminding myself that we need to post that on our website so that people can read about it. But that was a project that I really cared about, especially because, to dovetail with the issue of white supremacy, with the rise of social media and the use of online communication channels, white supremacists go online to recruit, often looking for young people who may be wanting to be part of a larger community. And we haven't addressed this in funding yet, but I'm hoping that a group comes to us, because one of the things many of these white nationalist groups do is, as you've seen with a lot of right-wing politicians, use language that, proclaims to be patriotic, freedom of expression, and values that we cherish, but that can be used insidiously to bring people into their loop. So back to a few more of the groups. This is, Hawaii. And we fund groups around the United States. We used to fund more international groups. We have several groups that we provide fiscal sponsorships to. We're reshaping how much of our resources we can allocate to international groups. But this is a coalition that is building a grassroots campaign directly in communities directly harmed by the military presence in Hawaii and who have been denied access to their ancestral lands. The El Mahaba Center, El Mahaba meaning unconditional love, is a resource and safe community center for Arab-speaking communities in Nashville, Tennessee. And they're working to strengthen these communities through cultural awareness, collective care, and knowledge about social justice issues. We funded their issues to identify leadership, young leadership especially, and to work in small collaborative groups on issues related to housing, driver's licenses, and community schools. And they've organized 5 live streams and really gained traction on a petition that, and I don't know the issue that was for, but they've held 2 town halls and they're doing a lot of organizing. Back from the Brink is a grassroots US-based coalition of individuals and elected officials and organizations working toward a world free of nuclear weapons, another critical issue, and advocating for common sense policies in that area. Beyond these walls is working for justice and liberation of LGBTQIA people incarcerated in the Pacific Northwest, and they use advocacy, service, and organizing. We gave them a grant to, again, nurture new leadership groups in Washington prisons. And then the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction, they use film and podcasts and archiving of local movement histories as a tool to organize abolitionist debates and conversations. They also are working toward a broader narrative shift around policing and mass incarceration. And then this is one of my favorites, Fandom Forward. They use pop culture. So fandoms are groups of fans of movies, books. Harry Potter is a big one. But they're tapping into these fandoms to educate people, to organize around gender equity, youth advocacy, media reform, and climate change. So the reason we like this group is, for us, it was a new mode of organizing, and we're trying to really stay on top of cutting edge ideas that have great capacity to change the minds of many. Oh, I want to talk about 2 groups that we also love, that we are fiscal sponsors for. Forensis uses video analysis to look for human rights abuses around the world. They're based in Berlin, and they're building case files to exact accountability for human rights violations, including police brutality, racism, anti-Semitism, border regimes, surveillance, environmental destruction. And I think there was a feature on them on 60 Minutes last year. They put us in touch with Earshot, based in the UK, who produces audio investigations for human rights and environmental advocacy. They produce forensic reports, 3D acoustic maps, and animations, along with explanatory videos that show what they're finding. And their written reports have been presented in international courts, and their videos have also been featured in global media. So we're very excited to be affiliated with these organizations. And if you don't know, being a fiscal sponsor is more than just having money pass through us. We, as a 501c3, are accountable for how they spend their money. We can review their documents and just make sure that everything they're doing aligns with our mission on behalf of social justice. I think that's about it. What does our future look like? We've recently increased the size of our grants. They started years ago at $2,000. They went up to $5,000. Now we have a ceiling of $10,000. We're also entertaining the possibility of multi-year grants to cut down on the administrative work that groups, which often don't have staff, have to put into to apply for money. And we used to just fund project support. Now we're funding general operating support, also realizing that these are groups that are small, and we want to be nimble and allow them to do their work and allocate their resources as best they see fit. We try to be low overhead so that most of our money And right now, we rely on individual donations, and after the sale of our building, we have invested in socially responsible funds, which is helping us also, enabling us to give our grants. I think we want to continue to raise our social media presence, find new organizations to fund. If you know of any, just send us an email. We're always looking for new groups. And with what we've added, rapid response grants, those give our board members and staff flexibility to look for organizations that might not think about applying to us, and then having them fill out a very simple application and getting them money within a short time frame, 2 or 3 weeks, so that if they're planning an action on the ground, they don't have to wait for the bureaucracy of deciding. So if you have any questions, that's basically our presentation. Hi.
I have a question. So these groups don't have to be 501c3 entities themselves. They just need to show that their mission accomplishes what you're looking for. I'm thinking of a group that is very ad hoc, that just arose around the suicide of Aaron Bushnell.
Yes.
And so there has to be a 24-hour presence. Do you know about them?
No, but
No.
yeah, but we know about
Aaron, yeah.
He took his life,
Yeah.
sacrificed his life in front of the Israeli embassy. So there's a wonderful, and I have a photo of it, so stick around for tomorrow. There's a shrine to Aaron, but then there's a 24-hour presence around the strip of sidewalk in front of the embassy where there are signs and there's a presence, but they have to be there 24 hours, so they're paying people to stay overnight because that's not the most favorite shift, but it's an incredible witness. So it's something that I think would be attractive to you. And from a legal point of view, First Amendment point of view, I went back there just about 48 hours ago, and now the Israelis have put in large U-Haul trucks so that the street in front of it is not visible.
yeah.
And so, there are 2 areas that I think maybe
Mhm.
what the Muste Foundation does. It's a remarkable, spontaneous bit of street theater, but it also makes an important point.
It sounds perfect. They don't have to be a 501c3. We even have added a provision where if a group, we used to require that they had a bank account. Now we understand there are groups that may not. So we allow what we call, it's like a grant by receipt. They just give us the receipts for expenses and then we reimburse them immediately.
Yeah, so we actually want to fund grassroots organizations. There's probably division in the board, but I think that 501c3s are not activist organizations. They're 501c3s that organize their time around raising funds. We want to fund people who are in the streets and engaged in this kind of protest that's visible, that's trying to just enter into public dialogue, and that's in the public square. And I know that there were soldiers who also protested immediately after the immolation. And so we would definitely love to fund such an effort, so let us know.
Yes, I think creativity is also key.
Yeah.
You reminded me of a group of elderly Black people, I think in Georgia, who were trying to protect a burial ground from developers. And so we funded them. I think they just needed a caretaker. There was some provision that the land had to be maintained, and we funded the maintenance of that for a year, I think. So we love creativity.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of how to formulate my question. I'll give it a try. If you were to ask the people of these groups how they would identify themselves, would most of them identify themselves kind of with the political left? And in a sense, is peace and justice itself kind of identified with the political left? Or are there some groups, for example, that would say we are for peace and justice and want to fight for it, but they would somehow associate with the political right, or the various ones that I saw there, I just kind of think of being left-leaning. Are there some others that would maybe be right-leaning?
Well, I think maybe you want to answer that question?
I think maybe I can answer that question. You all gave $2,000 to some wild-ass hooligan who was going to make a film. And he had to explain to everybody he interviewed that he was a Russell Kirk conservative. And no one said, well, I'm not talking with you. So your outreach is not position dependent. It is thought dependent. And there are many of us who, I mean, the labels are all wrong, but conservatives conserve. There are many of us who want to conserve, and part of what desperately needs conserving is peace, justice, freedom of speech. So, Tim, they walk that walk.
They meaning?
You. Yeah. They didn't say, what's your position, punk? They just said, good idea, let's go.
It's a great question. We don't, that issue is never, we've never articulated that when we look at our grants. And just so you know, our staff does a first round of looking through the grant applications that we get, then we pass it on to a committee of the board who further whittles it down. But we also document all of our reasons for perhaps not recommending a group, so those are all visible to the board. We want to be really careful that we don't make snap judgments or base it on, for example, an ideological bent. You know, we've also had discussions, we fund faith-based organizations, and recognizing how important they are in terms of our national activism tapestry. One or two board members occasionally worries they don't, want an organization that may be too religious, but I think we try to do a good job of looking at the ultimate goal and, understanding that people from all walks can come together and want to make a better society. So I hope that we do a fair analysis, because we certainly have criticisms of the so-called political left. We try not to compartmentalize that way, I hope.
I mean, we have different opinions about this on the board, but.
Right.
But we
Yeah.
fund everyone that stands for equality, peace, and justice, and First Amendment rights.
One more question.
I wanted to follow up on that comment about creativity, and it's important. Some of the things I appreciate about Muste is just his imagination of what nonviolent direct action can be. And I would be curious to hear how that is part of, if it's part of kind of what you see yourself doing with the people you work with, how to nurture the creativity and imagination to continue to move in these directions. Is there kind of networking that's part of this? Are there resources for just the kind of even the encouragement that people need for the long haul to pursue a vision of activism?
That's a really good question. Yeah.
Well, I think we depend on people like you to spread the word about Muste, but also to help us identify organizations and groups that are engaged in creative disruption, ultimately. That's what we want to fund, creative disruption. But we've come up with a new logo for the 50th anniversary, and we want to amplify our presence on social media, just to raise the profile of Muste. And we are committed to creativity. I wrote a book on the Young Lords. Perhaps you've not heard about the Young Lords. They're the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. But the Young Lords burned uncollected garbage in East Harlem and stopped traffic with the uncollected garbage for miles in the city. And through that creative disruption, they effected change. They got the mayor to increase sanitation services to poor Black and Latino communities. They occupied a hospital in the Bronx to protest the terrible conditions of health discrimination. So that's what we're looking for. And we want to find organizations in this moment that are still committed to the grassroots, to engaging in that creative practice on the ground, not on social media.
But I think, unfortunately, there aren't that many that come to us. When we see them, we're great, let's fund them immediately. We had a quilting project from California, social justice quilting. They were teaching young Black teenagers how to quilt, but for political, they made a life-size quilt of Trayvon Martin, for example, and had little shows in many cultural centers. When we see a creative idea, we always try to fund it, and I think that is a challenge for us to try to see how we can amplify and attract more of those. So we will be thinking about that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.